Hey everybody, it's Joe Trippi, and welcome back to That Trippi Show with Alex Sashlow. Happy New Year, all. This week, we obviously have to talk about 2025 and what we have to do to move forward. But first, we also have to talk about Jimmy Carter. Alex, how do you want to start off?
Oh man, what a full life. We could spend a whole year talking about him, but this is one of those things where he's involved in basically everything all over the world. Some of the pro-democracy stuff we can get to, but this is one of those times and where I know your path and his crossed, and I know you posted about this on says.us, and it's one of those stories where and you and I have talked about it over cigars and sour beers, and even hearing you tell it, I kind of scratch my head and say, how did this even happen? So, Joe, it's a pretty powerful story about him, and I figured you could lead with that.
As I said in the Says Us post, I have literally had this crazy thing where I have not just met, but interacted with every single president of the United States going back to 1976, except for Ronald Reagan. So Jimmy Carter was one, obviously Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, George H.W. Bush, and W. Even Donald Trump, I've met and had conversations with, over the years. And the one that sticks out the most of all of them, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, obviously had amazing conversations and time spent. But the one that just sticks out is Jimmy Carter. And it gets to the, where in 1980, I was part of Ted Kennedy's campaign presidential challenge to him. We challenged the incumbent president, Jimmy Carter, in the primaries for the nomination in 1980. And clearly, whether he would have won it anyway, had we not done that, you flip a coin, talk about it. But there's clearly no way he was going to win after we did it. I mean, the challenge itself made it any chance against Reagan insurmountable and impossible. But the weird thing is, every year in every presidential campaign, every single Democratic candidate, or almost all of them, have always made a pilgrimage since then to Plains, Georgia, to sit down with Jimmy Carter and ask him his advice about how to run for president. And so whether it was I was there with Vice President Mondale, with Dick Gephardt, Howard Dean, I mean, a number of presidential cycles, I would make that pilgrimage with my candidate or one of the candidates. And Carter, what was amazing is that just he exuded decency and goodness. I mean, here I had been part of a campaign that cost him any chance at a second term, made him, in his mind, I'm sure, and most Carter uh, people's minds, we were responsible for making him a one-term president in their eyes and in his, but he never treated anybody that way. He was always gracious and outgoing, had an open heart. And so, later on through the years, I mean, during like every 4 years, I would make the pilgrimage with somebody to Plains, Georgia. That was one way I sort of got some insight into his decency and goodness. But there were a couple other times. I can't remember. I think it was New Orleans. It may have been someplace else. I thought it was New Orleans after Katrina, but I volunteered to work at a Habitat for Humanity, building homes that had been, you know, wrecked in the ninth quarter, I think it was down there. And I was banging away, and I took a break to get a soda or something. I was walking around. I turned a quarter in another house that somebody was building. I heard some pounding and turned, and there was former President Jimmy Carter, just quietly, no fanfare, nothing, working on a Habitat for Humanity house for somebody, I mean, try to make a difference for somebody that he was probably never going to meet, and wouldn't know that Jimmy Carter helped build their house. And so, like, I kept getting these insights, but the really crazy one was in the 1990s, 93. I had helped elect Andreas Papandreou, the prime minister of Greece. and who had obviously all kinds of relationships in the Balkans and in Bosnia. Obviously, the Greeks and that region have a lot of contacts. And a good friend of mine from that campaign called me and asked me to get involved in helping find someone to get a ceasefire to help in the Bosnia war. And I had no clue what I was doing. I had no idea. I would get others in the United States who I knew in government and contact them, and it was going nowhere. And then one day I was sitting in this Italian restaurant in Alexandria, Virginia, and it hit me that there was only one person that could possibly pull all those three parties together. Uh, and and here I was, a Kennedy guy. And how was I? It was Jimmy Carter. I knew it was him. He was the only one. And so I went to a payphone. It was the Villa Esta restaurant. I don't even know if it's still there in Alexandria. There was a payphone, which is what we used back then. And I got up from the table and I walked up to the payphone and I cold called Jody Powell, who had been President Carter's press secretary in the White House and was a powerful force in Washington at the time at Pal Tate, firm he had founded post the Carter White House. And I cold called him and explained the situation, my contacts, and what I was hearing. And anyway, a long story short, after a whole bunch of letters going back and forth and interactions and meetings, and some diplomats going down to Plains, Georgia, making treaties to Carter, he literally, a few days later after I made that call, um, got on a plane to Sarajevo. And 3 or 4 days after he got there, he was able to negotiate the ceasefire that led to the end of the Bosnia War and led to the Dayton Accords, the peace agreement. And, it hit me then that most people don't know. I mean, you hear about different things that he's done, but thousands and thousands of lives in the Bosnia conflict were saved because Jimmy Carter got involved, brought the parties together. His goodness, his decency rang out. And most people don't know that he was involved in all of that, in any of it. And so, I just think that, so I wrote the thing mostly because I wanted people to understand that those were just thousands of lives in the Bosnia conflict. He touched millions of lives with his decency and goodness. And so I just thought I wanted him to be remembered, particularly going to the new year, that the goodness and decency in him lives on in the millions of lives, the thousands of lives he saved in Bosnia, but the millions of lives that he touched along the way. And look, I've read the social media, everybody attacking him for this or for that, or is it all bullshit? Look at his human rights record, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, look, everybody's got some flaws, but in our leaders, when you particularly look at the goodness and decency of this guy and what we now have as our leader in going into 2025, I mean, the contrast couldn't be starker. And be grateful that someone like Jimmy Carter did the things he did, warts and all. Yeah, I'm sure he made some mistakes, but they are nothing compared to the evil and destruction that is happening with our current president-elect.
So, on that incredibly optimistic note, I wanted to get to something, and this kind of came up pre-show when we were talking about Jimmy Carter, but like you said, with the Habitat for Humanity stuff, and pretty much every story you hear about him after his presidency, he was never afraid to just go and do the work, and he always had a smile on his face doing it, with that kind of sense of decency, because he just knew what the right thing to do was. We got a lot of work to do this year. We got a lot of work to do next year and ongoing. Joe, what of the work are you most optimistic about going into 2025 with? Give us some bright spots.
I think we all have to get local. It's us. It's us. What I see is a realization among people that we have to do the work, and that we can do it and we can make a difference, but that it's not going to, the wishful thinking about how the press corps is going to come and get it. If we're going to have to reshape the Democratic Party, or redo the messaging or whatever, that's us. We have to start, making our voices heard, with whatever shape the party remakes itself. And it's not going to be because big donors woke up and started realizing that it's time to start owning instead of renting or any of the other things I've been talking about. My optimism is built around, I believe that there are millions of Americans, millions of pro-democracy Democrats, independents, and yes, Republicans or former Republicans who are willing to start building a community of trust, and more importantly, of shared reality. We've got to build a reality-based community together, because the the Trump, the MAGA leadership will do everything to upend reality, continue to make the fog and the confusion so that people don't know what's up or what's down or what the truth is, and be real confused. But I believe we can build that community of trust, and that it may be 4 million, 5 million to start, but we have to build that community and get active. And I think that's the most important. And I see it's happening. It's starting to, it started with things like the Lincoln Project, the Bulwark, Heather Cox Richardson, these voices that emerged because no one else was building these information network or information that people could use. Dan Gilmore, his cornerstone of democracy newsletter. We should put a link in our show notes, because if you haven't subscribed to Dan Gilmore's Cornerstone of Democracy newsletter, he curates all the important things that are pro-democracy information, things you can do, news that you can use, and it's for real. And so you see these voices all starting to come together. We got to build that information hub. But I really, that's where I think the power of moving forward is. It's not and this is not a hit on the DNC, but the committees are going to go do their thing. We need to build a pro-democracy community of trust. And I think that's going to happen.
The one that came to my mind was, and it kind of gets to your point, but it's the idea that we know what the big problem is, or enough people are starting to wake up and understand that the system is, it's not just the politics as usual. I think it's the system as usual. And people are starting to understand, or individual people are starting to understand, that Trump's always going to try to pull you off course. MAGA's always going to try to pull you off course. They're going to try to get you to fight on their turf. And enough people are starting to say, I don't want to do that. I don't want to be part of that same system that's enabling that. So, you're seeing it with platforms like, you're starting with Says Us, people starting their individual newsletters, but you wake up and say, well, the media coverage is not going to change. So where is the change going to be? And I think the realization that it's not going to happen without us, therefore it has to be us, is pretty powerful. There's a good article, Joe, and I know this is another thing you shared on Says. This was from Dan Frumkin over at presswatchers.org, who do a ton of really vital work. But the frame he put together was really interesting, and I'm sure we'll talk to him in the new year too. But basically, the frame that he put together was, the press has to cover Trump like a con man.
That's the frame. Quote him. He said, at an August rally in North Carolina, for instance, Trump told the crowd, from the day I take the oath of office, we will rapidly drive prices down and make America affordable again. You just watch. They'll come down fast. And so then you see in December, he points this out, in December interview, with Time, Trump says it's hard to bring things down once they're up. it's very hard. There's the first con, and we've talked about this, unraveling before your eyes. It should have made for banner headlines and days of follow-up stories, but was largely, buried in the mainstream press. And there are so many more of these. And so it's basically, yeah, frame everything as the con man playing the con, the snake oil salesman selling you bullshit. And that's what we need to, it's to start framing things and repeatedly frame them. That's the one thing I think that people have gotten, that within the party, within the even the people who still think TV ads are the way to communicate within the party, did get that it is the mindless repetition of what if Trump's saying the same thing over and over and over again, and that we've got to come back. It's not just respond once, it's completely, basically frame this and continue and repeatedly define as a con man, that the whole thing is a con, that he's a snake oil salesman, that he's a hawker, and call every one out of these things out, because there's going to be many more betrayals to come. It's that the tariffs are not going to be paid by foreign countries. They'll be paid for by the American consumers, which will increase inflation. His mass deportations, if they ever occur, won't make anyone's lives better. They'll simply destroy communities, devastate a critical part of the American, labor force, and disrupt the economy. Inflation again, wages, everything is going to move. So I just think that Frumpkin was really onto something here. Now, this is the thing. We've got to get an information network hub that constantly pushes out that he's a con, constantly. And that across the board, the pro-democracy movement, and that's what we have to become, a movement. They're a movement to destroy democracy. They've been on this for 30, 40 years, and they knew what they were trying to do. We have to not see this as a campaign every 2 years, but as a movement, a pro-democracy movement to keep democracy alive and well and defend it. And I think thinking that the press is going to do that, no, that's not going to happen. We've got to have a unified messaging hub, not to tell the lies that they tell, but the truth. And by the way, one of the things that democracy demands, and that's why I don't think there's anything wrong with says us saying and declaring that it's a pro-democracy social network. What could be wrong with that? I mean, it could be partisan about that. We're just a pro-democracy network. But the reality is democracy, there's got to be common trust among us as Americans, that we trust each other. We may have differences of opinions, but we trust each other. We have shared agreement about information and facts. That's all been destroyed. So we have to rebuild that trust, first with each other, as members of the pro-democracy community and movement, and then start building it beyond in concentric circles outside of our own community and grow it. And I think that's the movement that we all need to be part of. We need to all help build. And that if we do, it will fight the disinformation and the garbage and the lies and the propaganda, because that's what's going on. We have to fight the propaganda network.
Joe, that's a really good place for us to wrap up today.
Yeah, we want to keep it short. We know everybody's having, recovering from the holidays, and hopefully had a great Christmas, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, whatever you celebrate. Hope you had a wonderful holiday season and enjoyed the new year and rang it in. And we have a lot of work to do, but I think we have a lot of optimism in our shared belief and common view of what America is and can be, and how we can join together to build the trust and community that has been just wrecked over, by social networks like X, by the lies that the propaganda networks have pushed out. And by the way, when you have a leader like Trump who pushes the poison, and then leaders in the party enable it and condone it, it just makes it a very powerful thing. We can beat it, but we have to build a unified network information hub that doesn't push out lies, but pushes out the truth and fights the propaganda. So thanks, everyone, for listening to That Trippi Show. We're going to talk about how we do that in the weeks to come. Says Us is now live. If you are sick of all the, what we just talked about that's happening on the misinformation on X, there is, and I don't call it Twitter anymore. I know everybody says, I'm never going to call it X. It's X. It's shit. There's a better way. So join us at sez.us. This podcast will always be free and is part of Resolute Square. Check out the latest at resolutesquare.com/Trippi. Please subscribe to That Trippi Show and leave a review on Apple or wherever you listen. Also, if you're listening to this episode on YouTube, please like and subscribe to get alerts when we post the next episode. You can always send us a question to thattrippishow@gmail.com or leave us a question in a review on iTunes. We'll see you next week. Thanks for listening.
Resolute Square.